Thanks for being here. So my name is Ash Gohua, and I run the ADOC Impact Initiative alongside PJ Raval and Gary Leonard, who are over there. So just before we start our short presentations, I just wanted to share a little bit more about the Impact Fellowship, our very first Impact Fellowship, and the Impact Initiative at ADOC. Like Grace mentioned, this Impact Initiative, we had like a preceding lab at the Haverford lab, I think in 2022. And so this is kind of like a second iteration of that. The idea behind our impact initiative was really expanding this idea of impact within this like nonfiction documentary space, right? And I think a lot of us are familiar with what impact entails. Impact with a capital I in documentary, where you make a documentary film and then you design an impact campaign and you attempt to, utilize doc to create social change. And we really wanted to interrogate that and deepen our praxis around impact, and think about how impact can be incorporated into this process of storytelling, not just after something is completed and finished. We identified some gaps and some tensions in relationships with community organizations where it felt like filmmakers were parachuting in with a certain doc or a film about a social issue and then tapping in all these orgs to like spread the impact or the awareness of something. And so what we really want to do is like fold this in early, right? Think about how impact applies even within the process of storytelling, how we can engage communities who are already doing the work earlier, and to build more equitable partnerships in that sense. And so with our very first Impact Fellowship, we have our 3 Impact Fellows, Vivian, Taz, and Faye, which I'm really excited to pass the mic on to shortly, so that they can talk about their impact projects. But yeah, it's our very first Impact Fellowship. And so it's really exciting to be supporting projects that are not necessarily documentary films. And this is something that we were intentionally thinking about as we were curating our fellows and their projects, is how do we expand impact beyond doc? So we're still using nonfiction storytelling, we're still using this aspect of storytelling, but we're not necessarily tied to the form of documentary. But it'll make more sense when they introduce their impact project. So I'm gonna pass it on first to Faye.
Can everyone hear me? Great. Thank you, Ash. Thank you, PJ and Gary and ADOC. Very happy to be here. My name is Fei Yuan. I was born in Shanghai, China, but I grew up in central Indiana. For the last over 10 years, I've lived in New York City, and for the past 2.5 years, I've been working as a curator for the Queens Memory Project, which is a community-led archiving initiative supported by the Queens Public Library and Queens College, New York. Now, fun fact about Queens, it's one of 5 boroughs that make up New York City. 1 in 4 Queens residents currently identifies as Asian American. So that's 25% of the total population, or 650,000 people. 2 years ago, I was the host of the Queens Memory podcast, which documented the experiences of 8 different Asian immigrant communities in Queens. And one of those episodes focused on the Chinese community in Flushing. Now, Flushing is home to the largest number of Chinese immigrants in New York City. Over 70,000 people live there, which is more than double the size of Manhattan's Chinatown. And this episode takes place against the backdrop of Hurricane Ida. So Hurricane Ida was a record-breaking storm that hit New York in 2021. It was the most amount of rain recorded in a single hour. So in parts of Brooklyn, there were over 8 inches of rain in 1 hour. And it caused massive flooding throughout the city, and it tragically took the lives of 13 people. Now, out of those 13, 11 lived in Queens and 3 in Flushing. And I just want to play back like a short clip from the episode.
Same type of illegal apartment.
Anyone in a lower level apartment like the one here suddenly felt doomed.
3 were a family living on Peck Avenue. A father, a mother, and a daughter.
3 bodies in a flooded basement inside of his apartment building. We're on the corner of Peck Avenue.
In early news reports, the Chinese family had no name and was a mere statistic. No one knew who they were. Even within Chinese community, it would not be easy to identify them.
Thank you. So the episode actually goes more in depth to talk about how the Chinese community in Flushing rallied to come together and help identify the bodies. And once we know who these people were, we come to understand what circumstances drove them to live in this illegal basement apartment. Now, it's been almost 3 years since Hurricane Ida, and recently I went back to Flushing, and unfortunately, very little has changed. And I wanted to do something about this, and by now I've attended enough community town halls to know that one thing that is a serious problem, not only in Flushing, but all over New York, is information asymmetry. So there are lots of nonprofits and government agencies that work on climate science and publishing climate data, but they often work in silos and they don't do community outreach well. What you get as a result are vulnerable communities living the realities of climate change, extreme flooding in this case, thinking that things will eventually get better, except they won't, according to the climate data that's been published. So for this Impact Fellowship, I'm going to convene 2 climate discussion groups at a local library to share resources and information related to flood mitigation, flood insurance, rainstorm data, among others. And this is one vector of capacity building, empowering local communities with the knowledge and tools to advocate for themselves. So through these discussion groups, I will also identify community members who are willing to go on the record and share their stories. And these stories will then become part of a larger neighborhood oral history project called Memories of Water, which will be archived and preserved at the Queens Public Library. And finally, with their consent, I want to use parts of their interviews and edit it together with news clips and environmental sounds and voiceover narration, which will then become standalone episodes in the new season of the Queens Memory podcast. Specifically, I will zoom in on 2 neighborhoods in Queens, Flushing and Hollis. So both are occupied by Asian residents, both are prone to severe flooding. They also share similar environmental histories where people's homes are directly built on top of former creeks and ponds. So if you can imagine in an extreme rain event, you get all this excess water on your streets that have nowhere to go, right? But water wants to go where water has always gone, to the creeks and ponds. The problem is in the place of those creeks and ponds are now people's homes and basements. So in Hollis, civic associations have organized since Ida to form a new environmental justice coalition, and I'll be working with this coalition to convene this climate discussion group. In Flushing, I will work with a local housing organizer to identify current residents who can represent their community and help us distribute valuable information. I do have to quickly wrap, but I'm going to leave you with a question that's been on top of my mind and also an invitation. So at the Queens Public Library, we see oral history interviews and podcasting as a form of cultural preservation. It's a way to preserve local histories that are often left out of history books. And we strongly believe that these local histories and stories make up the social fabric of a place. Meanwhile, these places, like Flushing and Hollis, are rapidly changing. sometimes due to forces outside of our control, like extreme weather and natural disasters. So what does preservation or cultural preservation mean when living in a place that's rapidly changing? I invite you to come to our fishbowl session afterwards so we can further discuss this question and continue the conversation. Thank you.
So I'm going to pass it on to Taz, our second fellow, to talk about their project.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm Taz Ahmed. I'm so excited to be an ADOC Impact Fellow. I do have some slides. I'm not a filmmaker, so it's really interesting to be in this space. I'm an activist, organizer, podcaster. I had a podcast called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. I'm going to get started with talking about Black Lives Matter. And in 2020 and in the previous years, there was all this conversation about how do South Asians show up in the space of Black Lives Matter? We were considered the model minority myth. We were considered anti-Black. We were considered passive when it came to thinking outside beyond South Asian issues. Next slide. And that really made me think about the Bellingham race riots of 1907. And the Bellingham race riots, for people who don't know, happened up in Washington State in Bellingham. And it was when all these South Asian workers in the paper mills were driven out of town by white laborers who were afraid of their jobs being taken away from them. They were driven out. And to me, what we were seeing happening on the streets when it came to activism now was related to a struggle that is 100 years old. We've been around struggling on the streets since 1907, and in some cases even further. Next slide. And it also made me think about how in India, the Black Panther Party was a source of inspiration for the Dalits out there. I think you can see, it's hard behind me, but you can see this says Dalit Panthers of India. And, the Black Panther Party was in the 1970s. So for me, when I know about the history of what it means to be South Asian and American, it made it easier for me to talk about being an activist now and into the future. Next slide. This is gonna date me. I started an organization in 2004 called South Asian American Voting Youth, where I registered South Asians to vote. It was the first electoral effort for South Asians after September 11th. I'm Muslim American and Bangladeshi. So it was a very big deal back then. And while I was organizing people to, vote, it was really hard for me to find a topic that we could unite on, because people weren't really talking about what it meant to be South Asian. So that got me on this path of figuring out, how do we talk about being an activist? How do we talk about our struggles of social justice as South Asians to this community of folks that haven't ever had that conversation before? Next slide. And in my nerdiness and in my digging into the archives, I learned about the Ghadar Party. So for folks that don't know, the Ghadar Party actually has a lot of history here in San Francisco. The Ghadar Party house is actually not too far from here. I feel like up near Nob Hill. The Ghadar Party was started in 1913. It was a revolutionary movement of South Asians from South Asia that came here for education, and they wanted to kick the British out of India, because remember, the British were in India until 1947. So since they were trying to organize the British out of India, here they would organize on college campuses. And if you see these students on this side, this is actually at UC Berkeley in 1915. So to connect struggles, right, we have student protesters on campuses now that are fighting for people to get out of their land. That's also what was happening at UC Berkeley. So this is a 100-year struggle. Next slide. I also got really interested in finding this history in Los Angeles. I'm from LA. So on this side, we have Dalip Singh Saad. He is our first South Asian and Asian American congressperson. He represents the Imperial Valley, which is kind of like the Palm Spring area. And he also didn't have the right to vote. I think he went to UC Davis up here, or maybe I'm pretty sure it was UC Davis. and South Asians had their right to vote taken away in the 1920s. And he was part of the struggle that gave South Asians the right to vote. And we got our right to vote in 1946, and that eventually led to him becoming a congressperson. And on this side, we have a picture of Kala Bagai, who has a street named after her up here in Berkeley. She also was a longtime activist in Los Angeles. She was part of the Ghadar Party, and she helped start this group, the American Wives of India. Next slide. I'm going pretty fast because I only had 5 minutes. So my obsession with everything South Asian activist radical history led to me creating this workshop, the Radical History Timeline for South Asians. I developed it for Bay Area Solidarity Summer, which was an Oakland-based radical camp we had for 14 to 21 years old. It's still going on. It's a camp that's been around for like 13 years. And I would do this workshop. And every year, I would do this workshop with my fellow organizers, Anirvan Chatterjee, who runs the Berkeley South Asian Radical Walking Tour. If you haven't done it, you got to do it. They're doing a San Francisco one, and other organizers. So we would do this timeline for our students, and every year we kept adding like 10 to 20 more images to our timeline, and they kept growing. Like I said, I moved to Los Angeles, and so I was a little more disconnected from the movement work that was happening here, but I got really obsessed with what was happening in LA. Next slide. So I want to make an LA version of the Radical History Timeline. So my version of LA is that, of doing this in LA, is not doing a walking tour, because nobody walks in LA. We're gonna do a driving tour. And these are some images that I have of like LA history, which I'm not gonna get into. Next slide. But I was a researcher at USC in the fall. I was a activist in residence at USC's Equity Research Institute, and we created a pilot project of a map where we plotted out all of the locations of radical history, which actually is pretty hard to do because there aren't like street addresses for a lot of places where we have movement. So it was a lot of digging into archives and figuring out birth, death records and what have you. So we plotted out 15 spots on this map, but my plan and my big dream for this map is that I want people to be able to drive to any location in LA, geolocate where they're at and press play, and hear the story of South Asian American history that happened in that location. Next slide. And then this is kind of like the categories we have on the right side. My ask of all of you is, if anyone is into maps or audio producing, hit me up. Also, to give a plug to our breakout session, we're going to be doing oral histories. And if you're interested in talking about oral histories, please join our session. I'm going to end it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Taz. And now Vivian.
Okay, great. I also have slides inspired by Taz. So really quick background. I'm coming to you from Philadelphia, Chinatown, although originally I'm from Ohio, so shout out to Midwest. Yay! But Philadelphia is Chinatown. Yes, we exist, Midwest Asians. So it's 150 years old. Some records are like 1870, 1871. And side note, actually our Chinatown was founded by Chinese immigrants who were fleeing racial violence in California. So when we were talking about our different projects, there's so many linkages even beyond the work itself. So just wanted to share some images of our thriving, lovely Chinatown. But also, in even just the last 50 years, it's been subject to at least 6 mega development projects. So that's like 1 every 10 years. I mean, in the last 20 years, it's like 1 every 5 years. So on the right, this is a newspaper zine from Yellow Seas, which is a radical collective founded in Philly, talking about the cultural genocide. So what it's focusing on here is the Vine Street Expressway at the top. Next slide, please. And that Vine Street Expressway fight was actually the beginning of the founding of my organization, Asian Americans United, and a lot of different Chinatown groups. Because, you know, our Chinatown, like many, was founded in like the unsavory parts of the city where no one wanted to be, like during Chinese exclusion, so families couldn't live there. It was just, you know, a lot of poverty, a lot of things like that. And then as folks settled, like it became valuable. This is downtown land, ooh. So here, this red block covers parts of Chinatown. It's interesting, if you ask different people, you get different answers of where is Chinatown in Philly. But you can see this thick black line, 676, that's the Vine Street Expressway. And it did succeed. The community fought off some of it, so it was supposed to take out a church, which was the only like Chinese community place. But a lot of it came through. You know, that was urban renewal when governments around the country were just driving highways through Black communities, through Asian communities, renewing. And so within this tiny little red rectangle, you see the convention center, which exists, the transit tunnel, which exists. And then you see these little gray squares that were projects that the community fought off. So this big gray rectangle, the Philly Stadium, baseball stadium in a downtown, why? But in that place, we have things like Asian Americans United. We have a school that serves BIPOC immigrant students. There's also a prison that they tried to place there, a casino, and now this blue rectangle, the arena. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I wanted to share some images too from the archive. The top left is the Vine Street Expressway struggle. So those were folks from Yellow Seas, folks from the community who are on the rubble of, you know, part of what were Chinatown homes. And then on the right, I love this image. This is Debbie Wei, who was there for the stadium fight. She helped found Asian Americans United. She's still involved. Chinatown is Trouble Town. That is her. That is really her. But that was, 25 years ago, 2000, the Philly Stadium. And after that fight, we successfully pushed back the baseball stadium, and then they grouped all the stadiums together. In Philly, it's very unique. You can take one subway line, get to all of them. So we thought that was the end of it, but I guess not. Next slide, please. So 2 years ago, the Sixers, who just lost in the playoffs, good karma, they announced that they want to put a basketball arena in Chinatown. I mean, new concept. So yeah, that doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons, and it really is a land grab. Like, as you saw on that little map, it's like right next to Chinatown. When they launched, they said, we're gonna be a good neighbor. I'm like, why? You can be a neighbor in South Philly. So in the 2 years since, or almost 2 years, there's been a lot of community pushback. We, do a lot that's tied to cultural heritage, so like showing up at Lunar New Year with banners, right? We had a huge rally last summer, press conferences, things like that. So a lot of that is kind of your traditional mobilizing, organizing, and the community's been out here. But it also has been very draining, very tiring. So there's a lot to it, just the length of a campaign. But there's also this aspect of narrative and media, because the Sixers, the developers, they have spent $5 million on advertising and lobbying, and they have ads on TikTok, Spotify, ads in Cantonese, and they're really trying to target folks in Philly and also in the Chinese community and in other immigrant communities to give up. So they've spread these disinformation. They've said it's a done deal, it's over, and there's this extra layer. So I was like, I have a lot of questions at the end, but there's an extra layer where Philadelphia, like many cities originally, it was like a majority Black city. Now it's like plurality. It's become more gentrified. It's become like less of a working class city. And so the developers have tried to push this narrative of saying, well, the arena is going to have 40% Black-owned businesses, and why can't Asian Americans just, let this happen for the sake of that? So it's these very pernicious narratives. I see my time's almost up. Just one more slide. So a lot of this project is really about storytelling in the way of making Chinatown real, right? It's not just restaurants, it's not just boba shops, but also this extra complex question of how do we address these racial tensions, and a lot of that artificial. When folks hear about the arena in Philly, they're like, F that. That's what they did in West Philly. That's what they're doing in North Philly. Why would we support that? But as the mainstream media, as this huge multi-million-dollar lobbying fight keeps going, the momentum wanes. So last year we did a project where we interviewed residents and workers in Chinatown. So we have these 2D boards that are actually posted in Chinatown and the audio transcripts. But what the project is thinking about, like, how do we get film? How do we encourage more people to share their stories, especially overcoming like cultural stigmas? Because getting these across the finish line was tough. People said, it's shameful, I don't want to be featured, like I don't want to be prideful. So a question I have for you all is like, how do we encourage that? How do we like kind of overcome those barriers? And then also, yeah, how do we win this fight? So thank you.
Thanks so much, Vivian. So later on when we do the fishbowl breakout groups, folks will have a chance to engage more in each impact fellow and their impact project. But I'm going to pass it on to Pallavi to talk about the ADOC microdocs initiative. Yes.